But what I thought I would do this morning is share some of my experiences and stories, and just pray that that'll be an encouragement and a challenge to you as it was for me. It's no coincidence that yesterday Ramadan started, the Muslim holiday of the holy month. And also, if you notice in your bulletin, the Power for Living is about a soldier who was killed in Iraq. And I didn't orchestrate that either. Samaritan's Purse is an organization you may have heard about doing shoeboxes, but they actually do much more than that. They have been around since 1970, reaching out with humanitarian work in the name of Jesus to those who are in poverty or in natural disasters. And I must say I was very impressed with their work. The backdrop for all of this is a powerful word, hope. There it is in Arabic as well as in English. It was emblazoned on the inner blast wall of our hospital, and it came to represent for me much of what we were doing there. Samaritan's Purse has formed what's called a DART team, a disaster assistance response team, similar to what the Canadian government has for disaster relief. And they've already had 2 DARTs, one to Haiti with the cholera epidemic, and then one to Ecuador after the earthquake last year. Wanted to just give you a bit of a geography lesson for those of you who are weak in geography. Iraq is in the Middle East, bounded by Syria and Iran. As you can see Baghdad, the capital there. And in northern Iraq, which I had actually not known a lot about, there's a separate semi-autonomous region called Kurdistan. It's actually very interesting, a very difficult relationship with Iraq because they are still part of Iraq, but they want to be their own separate country. They have their own flag, they have their own military, and in fact it's against the law for the Iraqi military to go into Kurdistan. So it's quite an interesting, tense situation actually. But I always say that the enemy of your enemy is your friend. So in this case, ISIS being the enemy, the Kurdish forces and the Iraqi security force teamed together to help fight ISIS, and are still doing so to this day. So northern Iraq is a region there, which is very interesting, is Nineveh. So Jonah in the Old Testament went to Nineveh. Some of you may know, well, Mosul is actually the old city of Nineveh. So back in the old days, BC, you have the old region of Mesopotamia, and Nineveh is up there in the Tigris River, and you can see the outline of modern Iraq there. And there it is today in 2007. There's Erbil, where we flew into, and it's, as Greta said, it's about a 50-mile, 80K drive on Highway 2 into Mosul, which is the second biggest city in Iraq. And then if you follow on the Highway 2 further along, it goes into Syria. And it also should take only an hour or 2 to go on the road, but because of numerous checkpoints and holes in the road, you're driving along something, the road ends and you have to go on a dirt path around. Because of all that, it actually takes 3 or 4 hours to get just from Erbil to the field hospital there. And we were actually stationed 17K from Mosul on the east side, just thankfully out of mortar range and artillery range. When you arrive in Erbil, it's actually, you wouldn't even know there's a war going on. It's a modern, bustling city. In the center, of course, is the famous citadel, which is the oldest continually occupied mound in the world. And you can see the bazaar around here that I got a chance to go in at the end. Big fortified walls that are still occupied to this day. Quite a contrast from years ago. There's the old ruins on the left and the modern malls and all the Western influence on the right, as well as, of course, the numerous beautiful mosques. So ISIS. ISIS is currently, as of I think last week, this is the territory that ISIS controls. And that is thankfully shrinking, although they do tend to just go underground as sleeper cells and go elsewhere, so they're not going to be gone anytime soon. But they're an extremist, for those of you, just to remind you, they're an extremist militant group who really came to prominence in 2014 with their attacks in northern Iraq. You may remember that. They overran Mosul. They were outnumbered 15-1 for the Iraqi security forces. But nonetheless, they took over Mosul, and the police and the militia fled. And more or less, they held captive over 1 million people in the city of Mosul. Hundreds of thousands fled when they could. They executed the police officers, and they specifically targeted Christians, as well as Yazidis and other minorities. You may remember the Sinjar massacre in West Iraq. And they set up a caliphate in Mosul, meaning that they wanted to rule the world, essentially. Their goal was to kill and destroy and work through fear and intimidation, and they thrive on hate. On one of the churches, they had written, "You love life, we love death. We want to drink your blood." They sow mistrust. And I talked to many Muslims who talked about how their neighbors be turned against them, and ISIS wanted to use all the affiliations because they're Sunni Muslim as opposed to Shia, and they would just infiltrate and cause absolute chaos. If a woman who was in Mosul under ISIS-controlled territory didn't dress conservatively enough, they could be sold in the marketplace for a few denarii, or worse. You think of the 2 Good Friday bombings in Egypt. When I was there in Egypt, there were 2 Good Friday bombings. Not to mention, of course, this past week, the Manchester bombing and the 2 recent bus attacks on Coptic Christians and one on policemen in Egypt this past week, all attributable to ISIS. And of course, there's the Philippines as well, and an ISIS-related group as well there. There's a man I know who had shaved in Mosul, and he was caught by ISIS and given 40 lashes in public because he shaved. One man I talked to actually had, ISIS had come to his door, of course armed heavily, and demanded that he leave his house so they could take it over. He refused, and they shot him 3 times. Amazingly, he survived. So I digress here briefly to just talk about the term evil. It's not a popular category in our modern mindset, but I think it relates here. Many think that ISIS are crazy or deluded or have a genetic propensity, or they just don't have a category to put what they do, but in fact, it is evil. There's an atheist professor, Arthur Leff, who wrote this article, which I found very powerful. He wrote that we all desire to have clear rules about right and wrong to tell us how to live. But we also desire to be wholly free and choose for ourselves what we ought to be and to do. And this is how he ends his article. All I can say is this: it looks as though we are all we have. Given what we know about ourselves and about each other, this is an extraordinarily unappetizing prospect. Looking around the world, it appears that if all men are brothers, the ruling model is Cain and Abel. Neither reason, nor love, nor even terror seems able to make us good. And worse than that, there is no reason why anything should. Only if ethics is something unspeakable by us could law be unnatural and therefore unchallengeable. But as things stand now, everything is up for grabs. Nevertheless, napalming babies is bad, starving the poor is wicked, and buying and selling each other is depraved. There is in this world such a thing as evil. And that's coming from an atheist. G.K. Chesterton once wrote that the doctrine of original sin is the only part of Christian theology you can tell by reading the morning newspaper. The Bible calls that sin, that we sin because we are sinners. The notion is as popular today as it was 2,000 years ago, but what fits our experience? The essence of sin is selfishness, and that affects every part of our lives. As a parent, I know that. I don't have to teach my kids to be selfish. It just comes naturally. An honest reflection will reveal our own shortcomings as well as those around us. And even those who vehemently deny this reality will be the first ones to demand justice when they are unfairly treated, or point the finger if they see hypocrisy. So it's not just the evil in ISIS. As Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, as he lay on a bed of rotting straw in a Siberian prison camp, the line between good and evil runs not between governments or nation states, but between the human heart. It divides the human heart and oscillates there. I guess this acknowledgement that all of us should think about. We have an infinite capacity for self-deception and the potential to commit all sorts of things. If we don't appreciate the potential for evil in ourselves and see our own pride and selfishness, what I would call the bad news, then how can we appreciate what Jesus did for us in dying for us, which is the gospel, literally, the good news? I digress. Back to Mosul. So it's a 50-mile drive from Mosul to Erbil. And as of October, this was a setting that ISIS controlled, all the way up to this river bridge about halfway between Erbil and Mosul. That's the Kurdistani flag, that's the Iraqi flag, and this was the front line. In October 2016 began the Battle for Mosul, which is the largest urban battle since World War II. Coalition forces, including the US, began attacking in 2016 in October. Over 50,000 bombs have been dropped on Mosul since the war began. The Peshmerga are the Kurdish militia units, as well as the Iraqi security forces, were teaming up to attack ISIS. And where ISIS controlled, of course, there was widespread destruction. Thousands and thousands have fled, as I mentioned. So by January, they had pushed and cleared East Mosul up to the Tigris River. And this is now under the Iraqi security forces' control, and ISIS was on the west side of the river, which they call the right side, looking downstream. I always called it the left, caused some confusion. And then in March, it shrunk down to the smaller section here, and as of yesterday, it is down to here. But still, it's very windy, narrow streets, and as they get more concentrated and more desperate, it gets worse, the fighting. But that's where ISIS is now still in a small section of the old town and the mosque, the famous mosque in Mosul. This is the bridge halfway through that. That's as far as ISIS got, going towards Erbil. They destroyed the bridge in 2014, and this was a temporary bridge that we drove on just to get across as they rebuild it, because now it's back under ISF control. And the destruction was everywhere. It was absolutely incredible to see. This was the main highway, which I said was all rutted and potted and full of mine holes. And some of the destruction, those are all bullet holes. And these are all ghost towns, as Greta said. No one lives there anymore. And they're booby-trapped often. So they'll leave behind a toy for a child to pick up, who will then pick it up and get killed. And so they have to have minesweepers come through, and so this destruction is mind-boggling. So this was an IDP camp. There are actually 10 or 11 camps in northern Iraq put up by the UN, and each one has thousands of people living in these camps. And again, I can imagine not the best environment to be all crushed together like this. Some for 2 years already have been living in situations like that. You can just see just a touch of the camps. Unfortunately, I couldn't get out to many of these places because we were by security, had to stay in our hospital. So these are just pictures loaned to me by friends and colleagues. This was in one of the villages. They had ISIS, an expert in subterranean warfare, and they build many tunnels to escape and to do their nefarious deeds. So this is one home they had taken over and the dirt they'd piled up. And this was the tunnel, actually, that they had dug to go under the road. And this is actually right across from the hospital. This is St. George's Church in the town Karakush, which had been under ISIS control and now has been freed by the ISF and the Kurdish militia. Beautiful old church they had burned out and destroyed, much like the one that Greta showed. They especially target churches and do burnings in the buildings and try to destroy as much as possible and write graffiti in black everywhere. They actually turned the church into a bomb-making factory. This was actually a table with a recipe book right there on how to make bombs and their old shell casings and so on. But this was actually in St. George's Church. Now it's being heavily guarded so people won't forget, and they're going to plan to make it into some sort of memorial or museum to what ISIS was doing. On the way between Erbil and Mosul, you see the ambulances lined up, the UN ambulances. Because of the risk of car bombing, you can't just drive one person from one place to another. You have to transfer ambulances to reduce the risk of car bomb. So halfway through, as you transfer from Mosul or from our hospital, they would have to change to a different vehicle. So the other vehicle would go into Mosul, into Erbil for the hospital. The last attack in Erbil was 2 years ago and was an ambulance that had been blown up as a car bomb. So this was the hospital proper that we stayed in. You can see all the blast walls there and all the security measures in place right off the main highway 2. And where the hospital was within ISIS territory in October of last year. So they had to do the minefields and clear the area and set everything up. World Health Organization and the Iraqi Minister of Health had invited Samaritan's Purse to come and set up the hospital. Obviously, they gave him so much money, and then it was the job of Samaritan's Purse as a steward to make the hospital, set it up, and staff it, and do all the guidelines that World Health and UN want them to do. And they did it all within 3 weeks. It was very impressive that they had this huge hospital set up just on a bare field, and all the tents and everything fully functional. You can see the blast walls there. They were 15 feet high to give us some sense of security. We didn't see any chemical weapons use when I was there, but in fact, the week before I arrived, they had 3 patients who'd been burned by mustard gas, an old World War I agent. And I know that in Syria, ISIS has used nerve gas. And as Greta mentioned, they had used chlorine gas that weekend in West Mosul. But we never saw the patients. Doesn't mean that they didn't get injured. So they'd be decontaminated here, and then they'd be sent on to Erbil if they did have any poison gas. This was my home for the 3 weeks. The emergency room, which is just inside the blast wall. All the gravel there because it had been a muddy field, so it was just everything you walked was gravel. And then they bring them in. Every patient has to be stripped naked because of the fear of suicide vests and patients blowing themselves up. So basically, no matter whether they had a splint or whatever injury they had to be stripped naked and put a gown on them or this sort of heat sheet, and then they're wheeled into the hospital to just keep it safe for the staff. So this was the inside of the emergency department that we worked in. Some of you may remember the MASH TV show that I used to watch as a kid. Well, this was more or less an Iraqi MASH unit, complete with the directional signs, and of course I had to add mine there as well. And it came complete with the emergency bunkers, so if any attack from above, that we would have our drills to run and hide in these bunkers to avoid, because of course it's open to the air. And that was our main concern, is that if a US or Russian plane mistook our hospital for an enemy target, then we would be in trouble. But thankfully, like I said, we were out of range of ISIS from Mosul. There was a Kurdish position, artillery position on the hills east of us, that in January they were lobbing artillery shells over the hospital into East Mosul. But thankfully that had stopped by the time I got there. So this is what it's like when it gets busy and the patients are brought in. And we were strictly a trauma hospital. That was our mandate from the UN. So we didn't see anything but people who had been injured from the war. And that was fully functioning. They had 2 ORs, which was very impressive, fully staffed with anesthetists and all the orthopedic equipment needed. It was very well run, very impressive how they did that. And one of the nurses I got to know quite well, this little child has lost both his lower legs from a landmine. A few pictures. So I'm only going to do x-rays. I didn't want to have anybody faint from any excessive gore, but just to show some of the x-rays that we took of patients. This obviously is a blast injury, and I believe this patient had bilateral amputation from the destruction. This was only a young child. That's the shrapnel, the metal in the leg, and obviously a bad injury here and had to be amputated. And this child, I think, was only 6 or 7. Actually, no, 5 years old. That's right. That one was 5. Often lower legs are predominantly injured because they step on mines or be shot. So you just see an injury here from an IED, an improvised explosive device. I had to go through all this UN security training, so now I know a bit more than I did about the various weapons that can be used. Obviously a fractured bone from a sniper shot, and again, bone destruction in here. And rehab isn't the greatest in Iraq either, so it's not just the acute injury, but they may survive that, but they have deformities, and how are they going to function the rest of their lives with contracted arms or a useless foot or something? I had lots of shrapnel. In fact, I brought some shrapnel with me that I took out of people's bodies as a memory, but there's some examples here. Often in these IEDs, ISIS will put all kinds of nails and bolts and screws, anything they can find, just to cause more destruction and damage. And you can see the metal in various places there. This was an Iraqi security officer who was controlling a drone to attack and do a drone drop grenade onto ISIS. But they got to him first, and they dropped a grenade on him. And so he only had 2 small shrapnel pieces, one here and one here. Looks pretty innocent. Well, this one I took out, and it was very superficial, just about an inch or 2 deep in his chubby side. He was a well-fed Iraqi security officer. But this one actually had gone right through his bowel and was in his tummy. So as innocuous as it looked, he needed surgery that next morning to remove and repair the hole in his bowel. Otherwise, eventually it would kill him. He was 22, I think, or 23. Obviously, bullets are used a lot there. This was another 5-year-old girl with a 50 millimeter bullet. The reason it stopped, usually, of course, it would go right through, but it bounced off her mother's head first, thankfully not killing her, and then it hit her in the leg because her mother was ahead of her and got shot first. And then the father was carrying her, and I didn't realize till afterwards that she had been shot in the leg. So obviously you have to take out the wound, clean it, straighten it out, and hopefully it'll heal and be able to walk again. And again, the destruction from these high velocity projectiles. This fellow was lucky because the bullet didn't smash the arm, but it still had to be removed. This man I saw came in with his child. Amazing, the bullet went right through all his hand bones, but missed all his tendons. Went right through on an angle. And there's destruction. Some people you just can't do anything for, and they just have to have clean things out, and their elbow will be fused. And there's no such thing as a shoulder replacement there or an elbow replacement, so these will be lifelong effects of the war. This fellow had a bullet right behind his heart, and he survived, but not without some complications. This is a full metal jacket bullet that we removed from the leg of this patient. You can just see the damage and the risk of infection and all that happens. These are some of the balls that I have in my little collection here. Somebody had stepped on an IED and had a number of these balls in their leg. So I brought back one for each of my kids. One of the things that struck me was just the teamwork and just the chance to do some teaching as well. I do love to teach, and in this case, there are times when things were quieter than I would have liked, partly because the bridges were out, and since the war shifted from East Mosul to West Mosul, then people couldn't get across to us. So if we were quiet, it wasn't because there were no patients to be seen, they just couldn't get to us. So they were more or less trapped, injured in West Mosul, still under ISIS control, getting infections and suffering. And it was heartbreaking for me to think that we were there to help them and they couldn't get to us. But one of the things that I tried to do was make the most of my downtime. So if I did have some quiet or time that wasn't busy in the emergency department, that I could do some teaching. We had 3 interns there. There was an Iraqi doctor, married, who was just newly pregnant there. And then there's 2 sisters, Haneen and Wraith, who are from Syria. And their father had been killed in the war by ISIS. And they were in training. They actually were getting a stipend to work at our hospital. So what an opportunity for, to do some teaching with them and spend, hours with them sharing and so on. So that was really a special time as well. They must have appreciated it because they made me a Nutella cake, or a birthday cake or a departing gift when I was leaving. So I think they did appreciate as women having someone take interest in them and teach them. So that they made me this. You can see Tim sort of printed in bananas there on the cake. But anyway, that was much appreciated, and hopefully seeds were sown and relationships were made. When I talked to a surgeon the day before I left, they had said, don't be insular. Make the most of your downtime and don't just, fritter time away. So a lot of the Iraqi staff there, when they have time off, of course, they love football. The national team is terrible, but they still love football. And so in the small area, they would play this very aggressive game of football. And I don't play, but I got in there right away. Within 3 hours of being in the hospital, I joined the team. So good thing I didn't tear my ankle or break my ankle in this gravel. It's very hard to play football on gravel, by the way. But this was the goal that they painted on there, and boy, they are aggressive. When I hear them argue, it sounds like, one goal, it sounds like a World War III is breaking out. I thought to myself, no wonder they had an 8-year civil war with Iran in the 80s. If anything about a soccer ball like this, it's something else. But anyway, it was just good to make connections with the staff and get in there and be involved. These are some of the soccer players, Mustafa and Walid. He was a Muslim translator, and Walid is a Syrian Christian. And it was really good just to develop relationships with them and spend some downtime with them when we weren't working. And they all have stories. Everyone has a story about ISIS and what's happened. It's just incredible. I wish I had more time to hear all their stories. And this, you may remember, we talked about Hiba. I sent a message, a 9-year-old girl. She had been shot in the right side. The bullet had gone through her diaphragm, nicked her liver, and then put a hole in her lung that went across, and it lodged right behind her heart as well. And I was in the OR when they worked on her, and she was very, very sick. She really should not be alive, but she survived miraculously and had a rocky course again with chest tubes for her lungs, and we couldn't get the bullet out because we don't have cardiothoracic support there. So we left the bullet in, but she survived, and she was almost 10 years old. And the other thing that they recommended to me is that, when you use your downtime, think how you can reach out to others. So I brought a lot of coloring pages to go color with the kids when I had spare time. And so Hiba was one that I got to know really well. I wish I had a picture of her, but that she was discharged. When I went back to get her picture, she'd already gone home, so I missed that. But I was able to color, and this was actually a picture she did for me of the three men in the fire, and she actually signed it, so that's pretty special. And the last day, the chaplain had been talking to her and asked her if she wanted to follow Jesus, and she said yes. And they asked her, do you want to tell anybody about that decision? And she said, well, I want to tell the hospital staff, I want to tell Dr. Tim and Hobie, the security officer, and the nurse. And then the chaplain asked her, but do you want to tell anybody else, like your family? Her aunt was there, a very devoted aunt who was looking after her. And she said, no, I don't think I should. So she understood what she was doing in the decision that it would have in a place where just by being called a Christian, you can suffer persecution or death. This is Hannah. She really had quite a story. She came in January and had been hit by a mortar. Her newborn baby was killed. Her 5-year-old child was killed. And she lost her left arm and her right leg. And she was a mess. But she survived again. And then they came back for follow-up. That's her husband there. This was a surgeon who helped save her life, and one of the OR nurses. And this is Zaid, the chaplain, the Iraqi chaplain who was there. And when she came in, she was like a celebrity because she was one that was really rough shape and they thought would never survive. And yet she did. And just amazing what they suffer through and what the losses they have. So I was able to get her picture. And apparently she also was very interested in knowing more about Jesus and why all these foreigners were taking such good care of her. The teaching was a neat part of what we could do, like I said, but the stories, Yasmine and I had talked about how we'd expect this group there to be quite unusual and quite dedicated, but they exceeded all my expectations of a team. This was, we called him Tall Paul. He was 6'6". He's an American doctor who had spent 4 years working in Saudi Arabia. There was a Dr. Bob who just came from Fez, Morocco to volunteer in Iraq. This fellow here, Mike, he's from El Paso, Texas. He had spent 2 years working in Papua New Guinea as a missionary doctor. And he had even talked about how much Jesus had suffered for us. And he said, in the same way, patients at the hospital would probably never hear about Jesus or experience his love through his people unless they've been injured. So in a sense, they had to be injured to hear about Jesus. What a sobering thought. And I met Andreas and Katie, a nurse couple, she was a triage nurse at the hospital. He was also a nurse working in the Emerge with me. And he was working in Togo last year, West Africa. And he contracted Lassa fever. And he came very close to dying. And in fact, his colleague who got Lassa the week before actually did die and left behind his family. But he shared about how he had a peace that he never thought he could ever experience as he was dying of this viral hemorrhagic fever. And he said he would never wish it on anybody again, but he said he would not exchange that experience for anything in the world. He stated that sometimes we need to be stripped of everything and undergo hardship to help us really understand what's important in life and to surrender to Jesus. This is Dr. Ararat. He's a Kurdish Muslim physician who just last month actually wanted to follow Jesus and turn from Islam. This is one of the Muslim doctors working there. Many of them have to change their names so ISIS doesn't come after them because it's really risky to work with foreigners and be in this kind of setting. These are two of the expat docs. The fellow on the right is a good friend, an orthopedic surgeon who works in Malawi, Southern Africa, with SIM. You may remember Kent Brantley, that name, the first American to get Ebola. 3 years ago, he was Time Man of the Year. Well, he was there too. I got to work with him, and it was quite a neat experience to talk to him. He just more or less had, after he recovered from Ebola and so on, he really felt that when he saw the appeal that he should also go there and help support the group. And he was an amazing person to share about his experiences. People asked him, well, did God heal you from Ebola? He said, actually, it's because I'm a Christian. I got Ebola in the first place. Because he was working in Liberia before the Ebola outbreak came. So he said that's part of the suffering of following Christ, is that he's just glad that he recovered. But he said he got Ebola because of his faith and where he was. I also met talk with one of the chaplains, Harry. He had been with the United States Air Force as a chaplain 10 years before stationed in Baghdad. He had an overwhelming experience in sensing God's love for the Iraqi people. And he prayed for some intervention or ability to contribute in a more substantial way to help minister to them. He ends up 10 years later being the chaplain at the emergency field hospial. The fruition of a dream how God in the face of evil gives us hope. What also struck me was the group would pray for ISIS. Think about it. To sit around as a group and to pray for those who are causing such destruction. You think about Saul, brilliant Pharisee Saul in the first century. He essentially was like an ISIS against the church. He thought he was serving God and doing good by persecuting those followers of the way who were called Christians. And then he met Jesus, of course, and his life changed 180 degrees. So that was our prayer for these people, that they would not shoot straight, that their timing devices would not fire, and that they would also come to realize that those they're persecuting is in fact Jesus, and they need to turn from that lifestyle they have. You think of the first couple of centuries and the growth of the early church in a hostile pagan Roman Empire. They also were hated and persecuted. And how did they conquer the Roman Empire? With love. That was the quote, see how they love each other. They couldn't understand that. Apparently 2 ISIS fighters were in our ward, our male ward, back in January, and the chaplain overheard them talking, and they were just saying, why are we trying to kill these people? Well, they love us. They're kind to us. Well, no, what are they doing? So it just shows how we are a sort of enigma when we live out our faith. This is Kawa. He's one of the OR workers. He is a Muslim. It took me for a tour of Erbil in the last day, and we went around and enjoyed the sights for the one day of being a tourist. And at the end, we spent hours talking about the difference between Muhammad and Jesus and having a wonderful discussion. He used to read the New Testament as a child, seeking God. And so I just pray that he will one day come to see the truth. You think how Christians worked in the 3rd and 2nd century. When a devastating plague swept across the ancient world, Christians were the only ones who cared for the sick, at the risk of catching the plague themselves. Meanwhile, pagans were throwing infected members of their own families into the streets before they died to protect themselves from the disease. I think of that quote from Tolkien, often hope is born when all is forlorn. This was a sunrise service that we had on Easter Sunday, a real sunrise service at 5 in the morning. And this are the hills. The artillery positions are all along those hills. And this is obviously looking east. And to worship together with people from Australia, the UK, US, New Zealand, as well as some of the Iraqi nationals and Kurdish people, and to worship together. It was the most memorable Easter service I can remember that I've ever experienced. My Jewish colleague in my office said to me before I left, he said, isn't it going to be hard to go away on Easter? I mean, you're going to miss the Seder meal that you sometimes do and the meaning of that, and then you're going to miss Easter, which is a highlight as a Christian for you and your family. And I thought, yeah, it is. Thanks for reminding me. It is going to be tough. But the more I thought about it, I thought, what a distinct privilege to be in the Middle East over Easter, sacrificing time for my loved ones, serving our oppressed and wounded Muslim brothers and sisters, working with other very committed, like-minded followers of Jesus to express our love and compassion as a team, providing physical and spiritual care. I mean, what better place to be than in Iraq in Easter? It was a distinct privilege. I would return if I could in a heartbeat. Those we help 20 years from now, will they remember the details of their care? They may not, but they will remember the gentle hands, the kind words, and the compassionate heart. Those foreigners loved their God and showed it. And I believe the hospital was a beacon of hope in a very dark place. My last picture captures for me what being a good Samaritan is all about, that Sally read earlier. This is Mohammed. He's an 11-year-old boy. He is an ISIS child. He was in a month ago after being shot in the leg, and he had hardware on his leg because his femur had been fractured. It's called an X-fix. So he had this big metal contraption on his leg for a shattered left leg. That's why he has crutches there. His uncle had been a suicide bomber and killed himself. He had not been the most cooperative patient, but we treated him well in caring for his injury. Khalid here, one of our translators, was reading the Bible in Arabic to him, along with Bible stories from the life of Jesus. When he left, he asked for more picture books about Jesus, and he left the hospital carrying a stuffy, little monkey stuffy that my kids had given, and some reading material about Jesus. To me, that symbolizes what our work is all about, giving hope in its fullest sense of the word to both patients and Iraqi staff. May we all be strengthened to reach out to a hurting world and live out the costly, sacrificial love of Jesus. I'd like to close with a quote from Reinhold Niebuhr. Nothing worth doing is completed in our lifetime. Therefore, we must be saved by hope. Nothing true or beautiful makes complete sense in any immediate context of history. Therefore, we must be saved by faith. Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone. Therefore, we are saved by love. Thank you.